WAIR, Talk Radio 1313 on your AM dial, broadcasting live into thin air, from sea to shining sea, and far into the great beyond.
Good evening, one and all, and of course, thanks for tuning in. You're listening to the distant ramblings of Clayton Lomax, your lone voice of reason on the tenuous airwaves, here to shed a little unnatural light on all things metaphysical and paranormal. That's right, folks. You heard it straight out of the mouth of madness. This is the one and only broadcast of the bizarre and honest-to-goodness cryptozoological sideshow, a place where we try to explain that which is categorically unexplainable. Seen a flying saucer? Tell me about it. Need to file a restraining order to keep Sasquatch off your lawn? Let's explore your options, from parallel planes of existence to the pesky poltergeist haunting your attic. Thin Air Radio is ready and willing to blow away the fog shrouding the unknown. From my humble little antenna perched high atop the rocky summit of Colorado's majestic Continental Divide, I'm out here waiting for your call. If you want to talk, I want to listen. Now, let's everyone ease off of those itchy trigger fingers that are poised on the button to auto-dial the call in line. This evening's fare veers off a bit, and most certainly takes us all down a road less traveled, at least as it pertains to our usual conversation. I'd like to say that this fireside chat tonight will be, from a transmission standpoint, originating from someplace a little less otherworldly, but then I don't believe that, and neither do you. In all honesty, this program is coming at you straight from the fevered gray convolutions of none other than the writer, narrator, and creator of the Thin Air podcast himself, R.J. Lonsdale. If that's not scarier than a joyride in a flying saucer, I don't know what is. Here's your chance to take an interrupted journey beyond the headphones and hear from your own master of ceremonies for each and every Thin Air episode. If all goes well, I'll ask a few questions about the show's most recent episodes and see if we can get an inside scoop on what to expect for anything and everything upcoming. In addition to doing a little reading between the lines, I understand that Mr. Lonsdale has also brought along with him a tale to tell that you will only hear now on the Clayton Lomax Show. A little story that he wrote long ago when he first dreamed about sharing his wild imagination with all of you. Anyway, now that the stage has been set, let's light up the microphone across the room from me and introduce Mr. Thin Air himself, R.J. Lonsdale. Good evening, sir.
Well, Clayton Lomax, as I live and breathe. How's the late-night AM radio business these days? Seems like it's been a little quiet since Art Bell signed off.
Indeed it has, my friend. Indeed it has. Art was one in a million. I still break out laughing when I come across his program with the crazy glue. Not conducive to hosting the show, gluing your lips together like that.
No, not at all. I noticed you seem to be keeping the adhesives at arm's length.
And then some. So RJ, let's dive right into this.
Yeah, Clayton, go for it.
Thin Air.
Yep. That's the name of the game.
Tell me about it. Why Thin Air? What's the origin story behind the show's title?
Good question. I guess it all started from some nebulous notion at a very early age. Gotta give Lucas and Spielberg kudos for lighting a fire under my backside. Star Wars, and then subsequently Close Encounters of the Third Kind, were like a double whammy. I wanted to make movies. At that point, I was fascinated with directing, being at the heart of it all. Ironically, writing was just a necessary evil to me. You want to make a movie? You need a story. I had a couple of friends back then that shared the dream, one of them a decent writer. I guess I just hoped the story was getting written so my little Super 8 gears could start grinding. We had what we hoped would be a couple of sure blockbusters in the works, an epic space opera called Imperium, and a nail-biting alien abduction story called A Question of Belief. At the time, I was deep in my UFO fascination phase, so Question of Belief became the first project to go into production. We ended up with a stack of reels that really never saw the light of day. If I'm not mistaken, a question of belief may still exist to this day in some fragmented form up on a shelf in the walk-in closet. It was all great fun until we decided to construct a life-size UFO in my parents' basement. Plywood, plastic garbage cans, floodlights, etc. By the time it was all done, it filled the basement from wall to wall, much to my dad's distress. Before we could even disassemble it all and take it to the location for the shoot, he flipped out and banished the contraption in pieces to John's crawlspace. Sad but true. In this case, I guess the question of belief is more about what became of the movie and less about the existence of extraterrestrial life. Then there was Imperium. I'll hold my tongue on that bit of business since it's a major topic for discussion later tonight. Somewhere in all this rigmarole is a good bit of stop-motion clay animation, too. We were all very much influenced by the movie of the moment, and so dropped everything else to focus on Claylian, a poor little astronaut made of clay, who met his untimely end at the hands of a clay facehugger and, of course, predictably, a nasty little clay chestburster. You'd be surprised how disgusting red clay looks at 10 frames per second. It was a bloodbath.
Wow, that's quite a story in and of itself. Still, I'm at a loss to see how your fledgling filmmaker aspirations lead to podcasting as your preferred entertainment medium. Must have been difficult for you to let go of the visual aspect of storytelling, no?
Well, Clayton, try as I might, those lofty aspirations ultimately gave way to other distractions. Dungeons and Dragons was a big thing back then. Of course, the other less noble pursuits, drinking, smoking. A little hard to remember what frame you're on, or if you moved your clay actor's arm for the shot when you're trashed. Meanwhile, computers were becoming a serious thing. My Atari 400 seemed to satisfy my creative urges, visually at least, at the time. From there, it was the Macintosh, and subsequently I got into graphic design and multimedia production. I guess you could say that ended up being my life's work. I didn't really know I wanted to write until the idea just sort of landed on my lap after having kids. I wrote a children's book called Snakes, Snails, and Sea Dog Tales with the intention of turning it into a computer game. When that didn't materialize, I started taking a serious look at other ways to put the story out there. That was about the time that podcasts were just starting to become a thing.
Which brings us full circle back to my original question. What is the significance of Thin Air? Why an anthology? Tell us all about the impetus for the show itself.
I decided I wanted a venue through which I could cover a lot of ground. It seems that once I started writing, the story ideas just poured out. Not just science fiction either. Name a topic, I can wrap a story around it. Rod Serling and his Twilight Zone are the most obvious blueprints I decided to build from. I like the idea of a literal space, a place, or time, or even dimension, where anything can happen. The Twilight Zone was such a place. That's how Thin Air came to be. By imagination alone, you can disappear into thin air. You're breathing the stuff of creativity. It fuels your brain, and it gives you the ability to dream. How cool is that?
So after all this time, you finally figured out what you wanted to do. You started writing feverishly. You set up an account to publish on Spotify and created a Facebook page to promote the show. Then you woke up one morning in terrible pain, went to the ER and found out you were in heart failure.
In a nutshell, that pretty much sums it up. I checked in at the height of COVID and ended up having a quintuple heart bypass with nothing but FaceTime to prop my spirits up. The damn virus put the hospital on lockdown. 6 hours on the operating table, not expected to make it through. Good times. Suddenly, I had this unquenchable urge to write, and write and write. That's what I've been doing ever since.
You have mentioned Rod Serling a lot. That's quite a legacy to live up to.
Indeed it is. I'm not suggesting that my humble little podcast can rival what he accomplished, just that his work has been and continues to be an inspiration. Not only that middle ground between light and shadow, original Outer Limits, Star Trek, the original series, classic Johnny Quest, Twin Peaks, and the X-Files, all of the above, it's all stirred into the mix.
That's fair. No pun intended, but what's the story behind Brightside Crossing and Long Cold Night? Both pretty classic works. Why did you decide to produce these particular tales for Thin Air?
I read both these stories in high school literature classes. Neither one of them for a grade. Just discovered them both in a textbook and decided to see what they were all about. Both left a very lasting impression. The notion of crossing the bright side of planet Mercury was just too intriguing to pass up. Same with Long Cold Night, a maritime murder mystery. Who could resist making these two stories into audio dramas? I didn't write them, but I felt that these stories needed to be pulled from the depths of obscurity and hopefully be enjoyed by others.
Hey, before we dive headfirst into the universe of Imperium, tell me a little about Once More from the Top and the Fall of the House of Escher.
Well, Once More is a tip of the fedora to Bob Fosse, pure and simple. It's not sci-fi, but dang, All That Jazz is one of my favorite films of all time. I can't dance to save my life, but Fosse took the art form to a whole different level. I wanted to acknowledge that. As for House of Escher, that was me dabbling in prose. The collective works of Edgar Allan Poe are wedged nice and neat in the gray convolutions. House of Usher in particular. Also, I've always been fascinated with the art of M.C. Escher. I decided it would be great fun to do a mashup. You can't deny that The Fall of the House of Escher is a cool play on words. The story has nothing to do with the Ushers from Poe mythos. It's unique in every way, save my attempt at writing like Poe.
And so, with that, we have arrived at Imperium.
Yeah, Imperium. I'm calling it my story of a lifetime.
What's the significance? Chapter 1. Dawn of Darkness isn't even the entire story. I think you mentioned at least 2 more chapters to finish the saga. Where does the idea come from, and ultimately, where do you want it to go?
Where do I want it to go? Well, to the stars, of course. The backstory behind Imperium is quite probably the most interesting bit of trivia of all. Like I mentioned earlier, the seed of the idea came from those early days of filmmaking. John Milas, my partner in crime back in the day, had some pretty lofty plans. We wanted the music of Tchaikovsky for the soundtrack, and we wanted Star Wars-style explosions to, quote, blow people away, end quote. Only one particular sequence would ever be committed to film, the complete destruction of the Imperial Palace, what I refer to as the Acropolis in the podcast. Explosives were John's forte back then. He spent an incredible amount of time rigging a miniature styrofoam castle with individual charges, all triggered from an impressive bank of switches on a control panel connected by wires out to a safe distance from the model. The castle was to be located on a frozen ice world, and we were filming in the dead of winter in central Illinois. Record low temperatures and a horrific wind chill factor. Crazy, right? Well, be that as it may, we set the castle on a mound of snow, much like the Devil's Tower from Close Encounters. At least Roy Neary had climate control. Anyway, the stage was set, film was loaded, and John and I were ready to create this cinematic masterpiece. I started filming. John flipped the first of many switches to commence the staged pyrotechniques, and boom! The entire castle vaporized in what was a perfect scale model recreation of the Trinity nuclear detonation at Los Alamos. And while it was truly spectacular, there is no physical record of it ever taking place. The night was so cold that the shutter on the camera locked up, and the entire event was exposed on a single frame.
So, in effect, that would seem to be the end of the story.
Well, seemingly, yes. Certainly it closed the book for a while, a good long while, as it turned out. Interestingly enough, however, I discovered that there really wasn't a book to close after all. Sometime during the work I was doing on Season 2 of Thin Air, I started getting all nostalgic. I'd reconnected with John Milas over social media, and we started hashing over old times. Of course, the subject of Imperium came up. You can't look back on your high school days that included nearly splitting the atom and not have the details resurface. I told John about Thin Air and where I was going with it, and at some point a light came on. I said, wouldn't it be something if we could adapt Imperium as a dramatized episode or episodes for the podcast? It was right then and there that I learned a story had never been written. We'd blown up the Imperial Acropolis all those years ago, and come to find out, all that death and destruction had taken place for no reason. Thank God John and I hadn't come away with frostbite, though at least that would have been evidence of trespass. Anyway, it got me thinking, why not take on the challenge myself? At over 2 hours long, Imperium proved to be quite an undertaking, and Dawn of Darkness is only the first chapter. I'm super proud of how the show turned out in the end, and now finally, Imperium has new life, thanks to Thin Air. Without giving away any details, suffice it to say that what we thought we knew about the Imperium universe has been lovingly preserved and expanded on. With John as scientific advisor, the two of us have collaborated once again to make something that started with a very big bang and ended up being the most ambitious Thin Air episode so far.
That's the craziest thing I've ever heard, though I know now why you consider Imperium your story of a lifetime. That has to be pretty satisfying for you and John. Closure in a way, even if you didn't catch the mushroom cloud on film.
We saw it. That was enough. And yeah, when Imperium went live on all podcast platforms and on the Thin Air YouTube channel, I remember those big dreams we had, and still have, even now.
Thanks for sharing that with us, RJ. Quite a story. Speaking of stories from out of the distant past, I understand you've brought along a very unique surprise for our listeners. A tale you dreamed up for your high school creative writing class. We can run that now if you like.
Absolutely. This was an interesting experiment, blowing the dust off of something you wrote with no real-life experience under your belt. Still, I thought it provided a unique look at then and now. As I transcribed the text from the typewritten pages, I had the overwhelming urge to embellish. It was painful, but in the end, what you're about to hear was narrated word for word as it was originally written. I hope you enjoy this brief little tale from a time capsule.
Flyby Studios presents Reconnaissance, a unique story written by R.J. Lonsdale, circa 1981, when he was still in high school. It's worth pointing out that this particular story was submitted and won a writing contest conducted by the local newspaper. We offer this little tale as a very early glimpse into what would eventually become the Thin Air podcast, many, many years later. So without further ado, here is Reconnaissance by R.J. Lonsdale. The night was cold and cloudless. A light sprinkling of stars shone brightly on an ebony backdrop, and this, in turn, was reflected and rippled in the mirror-like surface of the lake. But the mirror had a flaw in it, a large abstract shape, dotted with trees and littered with various sizes of rocks. Situated on top of a small knoll, alone and insignificant, was a log cabin. Diana Gardner lay staring out the window, in a state between waking and sleeping, looking at the stars, but not really seeing them. For if she had been observant, she would have certainly noticed a very bright white star moving into view from over the roof. It made 2 wide spirals down, zigzagged parallel to the earth a couple of times, then stopped for about 10 minutes. It then took off at great speed, turning yellow, then pink, as it faded in the distance. Diana awoke the next morning, refreshed and prepared for the new day. She went to the kitchen and made breakfast. 2 eggs poached, 4 slices of bacon, and a glass of juice. After she ate, she took a quick shower, got dressed, and went outside to enjoy the sunrise. At 7, the helicopter would make a drop, and she would be supplied with enough provisions to go for another 3 weeks. So until 7, she went into the forest to gather firewood. 7 o'clock passed by, then 8 and 9. Finally, at 10 o'clock, the familiar sound of rotors cutting the wind could be heard echoing through the hills and out across the lake. Diana ran toward the clearing, just as the chopper made a close pass. A small, white parachute popped open, and a few seconds later, the box landed lightly on the ground, just inches off the center of his target, made of whitish-colored stones.
He's getting better,
she thought to herself, smiling as she lugged the box back up to the cabin. The rest of the day went as usual. Diana took more water samples so that she could analyze the different organisms which populate it. Later, she took the small canoe out on the lake and did some fishing. That evening, she ate well. After dinner, she sat reading the newspaper, a rare pleasure. Except for the visit of Charlie and his chopper, the day had been ordinary. But all that was about to change. Diana looked up from her reading, having seen what appeared to be a ring of lights moving slowly from left to right just below the moon. She put down the paper, picked up her coffee, and walked to the window. From this distance, the object reminded her of one of those advertising planes with the lights rotating across its underside. Once it had moved to a spot high above the lake, it stopped. Diana felt a slight tingle run up her spine. For at least 10 minutes, the object, now obviously not a plane, hovered in the sky above the lake. Then suddenly, the ring flashed. Diana had to look away, the light being as bright as the sun. When she again turned to the window, what she saw was to change her life forever. A low hum and an occasional clicking of readouts was the only sound to be heard in the large computer-filled room of the Greater Minneapolis Weather Bureau. Ted Parkhurst sat in front of a keyboard, typing into the computer, so it, in turn, could send information out to weather centers throughout the area. Ted was in contact with airports, radio, and television stations, and the police, all at the touch of a button. After he had finished typing, he took a long drag on his cigarette and looked up at the clock. 10:15. 2 more hours to go. Lastly, he got up and walked over to a printout and ripped the latest weather picture off. idly looking at it as he walked back to the chair to sit down. He stopped halfway across the room, however, reached into his shirt pocket, and took his glasses out. What it was that so baffled him was that in an area that's supposed to be clear, there was a formation of dots, each spaced an equal distance apart, the whole making up the shape of a ring. He went to the bulletin board and compared the printout with one made just 15 minutes ago. Whatever they weren't there at that time. Ted wasted no time in contacting the airport. They reported having nothing of the sort on radar and told Ted it might be some strange cloud formations. Ted knew better. They told Ted to stay where he was, and they would send someone right over to talk to him. Ted thought the man on the other end of the line sounded kind of nervous, but he couldn't tell for sure. As her vision slowly returned, Diana observed 6 huge fiery white globes of light, all about 20 feet from the surface and spaced equally around the perimeter of the lake. Each of these objects had an intense beam of light extending from the underside of them, shooting down deep into the water. So hot were these beams that they caused massive columns of steam to rise high in the sky. As Diana watched in amazement, each of the objects began to move slowly toward the center of the lake. In order for 2 of them to do this, they would have to pass directly over the island. Diana broke herself from the trance-like state she was in and pulled down the shades. She ran to the door and bolted it. She put out all of the lanterns, then sat down in a chair and waited. She sat there in the dark for seconds, but to her, it seemed like an eternity. Suddenly, the room was flooded in light. A sound like that of a million enraged hornets filled the air. The smell of ozone was stifling. Her skin felt as though it were crawling with ants. Heat waves rippled around her, and as she watched, the newspaper caught fire, blackened, and fell apart. She flinched when a glowing orange ember fell to the floor in front of her. Looking up, she saw that the entire roof was ablaze. Leaping to her feet, she ran to the door, unlocked it, and threw it open. A horrifying but awesome sight awaited her gaze. 2 of the burning globes, like twin suns, were slowly revolving above the southern tip of the island. Bolts of violet-hued lightning arced back and forth between them. The ground shook due to the horrendous roar of physics gone mad. A splitting, cracking sound came from behind her as she turned just in time to see the last of her cabin cave in on itself. Not knowing what she was doing and not really caring, she started to run. She ended up at the water's edge, and luckily, where her boat was situated, turned upside down near the shoreline. Hurriedly tipping it over, Diana pushed it into the water, jumped in, and reached for where the oars were supposed to be, but weren't. They were both back at the cabin, leaning against the fireplace, and most likely crumbled to ashes by now. She searched frantically for something else to paddle with, but to no avail. Just then, her attention was again drawn to the objects. They were all arranged in a tight circle now, all engulfed in a thick cloud of steam. Below them, the water began to churn and boil. The light from the objects intensified, and as it did so, the waves crashed harder. Soon, mud, rocks, sand, and other debris were coming up within it. And then, rising up out of all this turbulent maelstrom, came the most incredible thing of all. A black, hulking shape began rising out of the water, caked with mud and oozing with decay. Leeches and other parasites clung to the corroded metallic surface. Torrents of water poured from a wide crack running down its side. Its shape, like that of the others, was spherical, and it may once have been as flawless as they were. With precision accuracy, the decayed craft was raised to the same height as the others. Then, the entire ring of ships took on a deep, blue glow. The roaring sound ceased, and a calming hum took its place. Arcs of electricity, red, orange, and yellow began dancing between them. As Diana watched, the crack on the damaged ship faded away. Then, it too began to glow like the others. All sound, save the chirping of crickets, stopped. Silently, the ring of ships began to move. They sailed up over the island, then hovered. From beneath them all, tiny purple crystals fell to the ground. The whole island, in a matter of seconds, shimmered brightly. A pleasant odor came to Diana's nostrils. She started to become very sleepy. The last thing she saw before losing consciousness was a ring of electric blue globes ascending to the stars. She awoke sitting in her chair, newspaper in hand, and a cup of coffee by her side. Thinking now that it all must have been a dream, she got up, went to the kitchen, dumped the cold coffee down the sink drain, went into the bedroom and switched on the radio next to the bed, laid down, and quickly fell fast asleep. Seconds after she had nodded off, the relaxing music that was playing was abruptly silenced, interrupted by a special news bulletin.
We interrupt our regularly scheduled broadcast to bring you this breaking news item. Ted Parkhurst, trusted local meteorologist, lost his job today for apparently claiming to have tracked a cluster of unidentified flying objects earlier this evening on radar. At this time, Parkhurst could not be reached for comment. The Greater Minneapolis Weather Bureau issued a statement indicating that Parkhurst was not reliable, and that what he had tracked on radar tonight was nothing more than a flock of geese flying south in a circular formation. We return you now to our regularly scheduled program already in progress.
You're sort of like Fox Mulder on steroids, aren't you?
You could say that.
It's an educated guess. I happen to know a lot about the subject matter. Well, RJ, looks like we're almost out of time. One last question before we say goodnight. What's up next for you?
Well, Clayton, the 2024 Halloween episode is out there. It's called Egghead and promises to be a real shocker, albeit somewhat cerebral. I've been considering revised versions of The Passenger, new voices so that I can stick to the opening and closing narration. Nothing certain yet, though. Of course, I want Imperium to continue. Beyond that, I'm thinking that a Western might be on the not-too-distant horizon. I guess we'll see. Regardless, I hope you'll all keep listening. It means a lot to me.
RJ, it has been a real pleasure speaking with you tonight. Thanks for joining me in the Thin Air studio. Come back anytime.
You've got a deal, Mr. Lomax. I'll drop by for another chat sometime soon. To all your listeners, thanks for tuning in. I'm glad to have had this chance to share some of the stories behind the stories that come to you out of the misty regions of thin air. Good night, everybody.
So long, folks. Episode 27 of the Thin Air podcast anthology, The Clayton Lomax Show, an interview with RJ Lonsdale on Thin Air AM radio, was written, produced, directed, narrated, and told by RJ Lonsdale. The voice of yours truly, Clayton Lomax, was performed by Sid Mason. The voice of the reconnaissance narrator was performed by Ted Jameson. Diana Gardner was performed by Lisa Cole. The late-breaking newsman was performed by Joey Reeve and RJ Lonsdale as himself. Audio production for this Thin Air episode by RJ Lonsdale of Flyby Studios. The music composition used in this episode was Mystery by We Free Music, licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 3.0. This has been an RJ Lonsdale Flyby Studios presentation.